Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week, we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining us, as always, in New York is FP's economics columnist, Adam Tooze. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, we're excited to announce that we're going to be kicking off a small series that we've planned over the next 3 weeks that will be dedicated to the economics of World War II. And we'll start with that in just a second. But we thought we'd start off the episode with a discussion of stuff generally happening in the news, or generally happening in Trump world, more specifically. I was intrigued, Adam, by a couple of recent articles you wrote for your Chartbook Substack. And they made a kind of overall assessment of Trump's political project, and I think advanced fair to say, a pretty counterintuitive argument. And I guess maybe I'll try to sketch it. You'll tell me if I get it right or wrong, and maybe can expand on it just a bit. You know, you basically make the case for the Trump administration having a sincere political project that's oriented towards the future. And the reason that's counterintuitive is because, you know, it's tended to be, I guess, the left that, you know, like to think of itself as the more democratic faction of politics, and that democratic essence sort of coming in by having this relationship to the future. In fact, you sort of argue that any real politics worthy of the name sort of has to have a vision of the future, has to draw on that vision as a resource for political energy and organization. And yeah, for the left, that's generally been a vision of progress, a vision of history with forward-moving meaning, and suggestion that sacrifices should be made for that future. And Trump, by contrast, you know, is tended to be described as pretty cynical, essentially, maybe even sadistic in some sense, you know, sort of, rather than kind of steering towards a better future, more kind of like, you know, not really giving any reason to think our social problems will be solved, you know, just trying to basically just eke out what's best for himself or for his backers specifically, even if the future is darkening. And that's, I guess, sometimes what his economic policy is described as pursuing. And then you sort of give some reason to disagree. You suggest that, you know, the Trump administration's relationship to the future, in some respects, comes in the form of as some kind of real social movement, rather than just being essentially cynical. And curious, what then is that vision of the future, and I mean, it seems to me like you sort of flag trade and technology as the kinds of forms or the policies in which that kind of vision of the future can be seen, and what's going on in those two fields of policy, trade and technology, that suggests that's the case.
Yeah, the question of the future is a fascinating one, and it has a kind of backstory, right? The backstory is not quite the one that you were sketching, where, you know, democracy and progress owns the future, but rather a kind of skeptical, quizzical worry on the part of the left that we've lost the future. So I was starting a position of, you know, people like Mark Fisher, the British, well, what are we going to call him, post-Marxist cultural theorists, who talked about the cancellation of the future, or the famous Fred Jameson quote, you know, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, that kind of point of view. And from that angle, there is a read of Trump which is unbelievably bleak, which basically says Trump is fascism without the future. So this was a piece that Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor, and the notable activists in the North American sphere, launched, which is to say that, you know, there's this authoritarian, violent, sadistic streak, which is fascist, but the fascists at least promised a future. They promised them a better world. You know, they're going to build a national socialist German workers' world. And if you were on the right side of that, that was the future they were going to give you. And the horror of Trump is that it's the authoritarianism and the fascism without the comprehensive vision of a transformed American society. And that's kind of, I think it might work as an analysis of, you know, truly folks like Peter Thiel, Palantir's boss, like a really kind of radical, hard thinker of the new right. But as an analysis of Trump as a general phenomenon, it just seemed to me to not quite ring true. And if you ask what a politics of the future would really look like, you would seem to think that it had something about, you know, a critique of the present, organizing a collective sense around which we all head towards that future, and then a willingness to sacrifice for that common project. These are the criteria that were developed by a political theorist, Jonathan White. I've been teaching all of this stuff. It's the end of term. I've been running this great class called Democracy and Capitalism. All of this was fired up by the conversations we were having there. We were reading this political theorist, and in the class, we were all kind of looking at ourselves and going, well, actually, Trump does all of those things. He compares a future, brighter America to the present, which is miserable, and the past, which is bad. He mobilizes a MAGA faction around that vision of a better America, and he asks for sacrifice. And so my kind of wager against my friends on the left who are trying to read Trump as, bleaker than fascism is actually maybe this is a more conventional kind of future-orientated transformative politics than they think. And the crucial point to make here is I'm not saying this is a good politics, or I think it'll win, or I think it's particularly sincere. The question is the question of the future the right point to which to apply our critique? And so I illustrate this with regard to two aspects in these newsletters. One is trade and the other is Elon Musk.
Okay, so then let's take those one at a time. How do we see this orientation towards the future play out in trade policy, first off?
Yeah, so the trade thing, I was really triggered by this extraordinary interview, people may have seen it, that Trump gave last weekend, where, in his typical extraordinarily sexist patriarchal style, he declares that maybe your beautiful baby girl, by which I think he imagines like this a cute American daughter who's 11, I think, in his mind. Like, maybe she doesn't need all the dolls that she's got. Maybe she needs only 3 dolls. She doesn't need all this stuff that's coming from China. We don't need any of this stuff that's coming from China. J.D. Vance famously described as being made by Chinese peasants. We don't need any of this. We don't need the washing machines. We don't need the cheap stuff. And that just struck me as really kind of just mind-boggling in the examples chosen and the rhetoric and the misogyny and all of that. But also just mind-boggling in the sense that this was actually an American president on television saying to Americans, you don't need all the stuff. And when was the last time an American president said to the American electorate, you don't need all the stuff? You don't this cheap stuff, you don't need it all. And that kind of triggered for me this kind of thought, whoa, here is a politics actually of sacrifice. And what's it a sacrifice for? It's a sacrifice for the imagined industrial future of the United States, the tariff policy. So, there's an element in which the Republicans are just in denial about tariff policy. They don't want to recognize that it's going to hurt, but they're now moving into the stage when it's becoming real, and they are actually saying out loud, yeah, we're going to have to go through a phase of transition in which things cost more and you have less, with a view to building a better American future. And that's nothing if not a futuristic policy. And furthermore, it's a bargain which the progressive politics and the Biden administration was never, ever willing to demand of the American electorate, right? The whole premise of Biden's green energy policy was no carbon taxes. You can't do carbon taxes like the Europeans have. American consumers won't wear it. So our vision of transformation has to be no losers, bottomless mimosas, endless subsidies. And the Trump administration has just come along and said, no, for our vision of the industrial future, you're going to have to pay a price. Your daughter will have few adults. And where do we even get off coming from the left in saying they don't have a future politics? Who is it that appears not to have a future politics here? And that's my pushback. That's my gut check.
Yeah. Okay. Then I would say that one thing is striking about that rhetoric of sacrifice in Trump's case is that it comes under the pressure of some evoked emergency. I mean, I think that's also when it comes to the left demanding sacrifices, there's something, I guess, to wonder about I guess, evoking climate change as an emergency, or is emergency itself a kind of more regressive idea, almost like it has to be a kind of national emergency ultimately of the kind that Trump is always sort of implying. But
I think that's a super interesting twist. One could go there. I totally agree, but I don't think it doesn't void the argument that clearly Trump is employing he's employing a trade-off argument where you accept pain now for a better future. And to a degree that, we haven't seen in American democratic politics much.
Yeah, in some sense, maybe that's more a critique of White's argument that you were drawing on, in the sense of, is there something about sacrifice and if it relies on some kind of emergency that makes itself suspicious in some way. But to shift to the other area of policy that you flagged in terms of its relationship to the future is technology in the form of Elon Musk. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there the argument is, and I'm just running this kind of self-check, right? I'm trying to say, like, let's check our biases here. Like, there's so much to hate, there's so much to be disgusted by, there's so much to be outraged by. Is this clouding our thinking? And, can we see whether or not Trump is actually offering a trade-off argument? I feel like we're having a hard time seeing that he's doing something that we didn't do when we were advocating for the Green New Deal. Likewise with Musk, it seems to me that he's for many of us, such a repellent figure, and has become even more so with the Doge assault on American public services, that we have a hard time recognizing the material effects of Musk, like what he's done in the world. Right? And I find a reading of Musk that says that he's a figure of end times who has not in a substantial way mapped out a futuristic intervention, if we're not going to call it politics. I just find that bamboozling, because especially from a green point of view, because the paradox we surely have to come to terms with is that this figure we've done our best to locate Musk on this show, and it's not easy to do. But the effect is that he made electric vehicles, he built the vision of what electric vehicles are looking like, right? BYD is going to beat him competitively, the Chinese firm, but they are operating in the space that Tesla shaped. Cool, upmarket, high value. That's the Tesla shtick. I mean, after all, Musk is the guy who put Donald Trump in a Tesla, in an electric vehicle, not a golf cart, in an actual electric vehicle. This is what the green project of trying to make the energy transition broadband acceptable in American society was surely about, right? Ford tried it with the F-150 truck that we talked about also on this show, like somehow jumping across this line. And Tesla did it, and Tesla and Musk did it. They built a kind of almost populist base around their project, which we on the left in the Green New Deal absolutely failed to do, though we all understand why it matters. And then beyond that, this is just the opening gambit, right? It's quite clear, I think, that Musk's ultimate ambition, which is what makes him so different from other tech guys, is it's not tiny chips or abstract platforms. It's stuff in the world that moves. And after cars, it's rockets. And when we go to rockets and space travel, much of the progressive politics just glazes over and goes, this is, bad boy sci-fi silliness. But satellites aren't silly. Like Mars exploration as a project probably is. And what I gather from insiders is that NASA is way ahead on that kind of deep space exploration. But SpaceX has utterly changed the satellite game. Like if you look at the history of satellite launches since 1957, when Sputnik was put up and shocked the world, it's a flat line until you get to 2019 and SpaceX really taking off, and it goes vertical. Like SpaceX last year put almost 5 times as much tonnage into space as the governments of Russia, China, and the United States and Europe put together, like a private business. He has about 60% of all satellites in space right now. You cannot see the stars in the old way because of Musk's stuff. So to simply dismiss this as space junk and silly boy adventurism is an anti-materialist. This is really bad politics. This is not recognizing what's going on. And the payoff is real in terms of business. It's one of the things which is making him wealthy right now. And the other thing is it's geopolitical, and this golden dome absurdity, which again, you can't help sniggering. It's so silly because it's, the Trump equivalent of Israel's Iron Dome, like his, of course, is golden, is incredibly expensive, but much less expensive and now kind of doable for the Pentagon because of what SpaceX has done to the launch costs, which are a fraction of what they were when they originally budgeted this. Again, if we're serious about thinking about the future, the question is, okay, of course, prevailing circumstances, the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party put obstacles in our way, but there may also just be a problem on the progressive side of the fence in that we're not open to this kind of contaminated, dirty, shitty, nasty kind of vision that is actually very, very real and is really going to shape the world. And so that's what I'm trying to, set in motion.
Yeah, no. I mean, I was certainly persuaded reading your article that the space technology is genuinely important. I suppose the question I came away with was whether it's sort of future promise, of this space technology is democratically political in any way. I mean, you say plausibly it's geopolitical, but it's hard to sort of point to a constituency democratically that sort of falls behind it.
Well, unless you're in a developing country and the prospects of any other kind of wiring are zero, and there's 2.5 billion odd people that don't have access to internet right now, and their best bet may be something like Spacelink. And the real question is like why it wasn't a public project, why this isn't a public ambition. There's no reason why this shouldn't be a democratic project. The horror, and I think also part of Musk's drift to the right in part, is that people don't embrace this. They don't get it. They don't understand the scale of what he's trying to do. So he's just doing it himself with his immense wealth and leverage and this incredible combination of populist persona and financial market backing that he's been able to create. And he is impatiently trying to change the world, and I think he perceives politics as kind of unresponsive to that impatience. This is what we were talking about when we did the Musk segment. And I think we should at least not turn a blind eye or just be, dismissive of what he's doing. To describe all of this as space junk and caricature it as just like Mars travel doesn't get to first base.
Well, I'd encourage everyone to read Adam's Substack generally, but these articles in particular. You can find them on his Substack, of course. But we should shift to the next topic, which I've already mentioned, namely the economics of World War II. This week, we'll be talking about the economics of the war itself. And next week, we'll shift to talking about the economics of the aftermath. And then we'll do a segment on the economics of the Holocaust, which obviously was a major part of the war, but we thought it would be good to treat that separately. So don't be surprised if we don't delve into that topic this week or next. We certainly will get to it. But our data point for this week is 80, which for anyone reading or following the news, this is the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe.
Charles has led commemorations for the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. More than 1,300 members of the UK armed forces marched through.
Mongolia's president touches down in Moscow, the latest in a succession of heads of state to arrive ahead of festivities marking the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany.
We're recording this on May 8th, which happens to be a public holiday here in Berlin, the day that fighting stopped in Europe. Of course, the war continued elsewhere in Asia, namely, but it is a moment to reflect on the meaning of that war. From a U.S. perspective, one thinks of the war in terms of kind of broad ideas of international cooperation, mobilization, solidarity against a kind of pernicious force here in Europe. But obviously the war represents much more than that. It was a destructive, violent war that changed the world, and that's what we'll try to unpack in the next couple weeks. So, Adam, to start off with, if we were just to try to describe World War II as an economic event, how would we go about doing so to begin with? I mean, maybe just to start off with, how big was the war?
I think this is a moment when really talking about quantity and size and scale is important, because it was just very, very big. I think that's the thing to say. And it's important to say that also as a corrective, because, folks will have heard in recent years people talking about war economies in Europe. It's very current right now to talk about the need for Europe to go onto a war footing in its war with Russia. There's quite a lot of talk in the US about that as well. In the Biden presidency, Biden really liked, who's a child of the war, really liked references to World War II. Around COVID, there was talk of, a kind of war economic situation and a resetting of the social contract like happened after World War II. Around climate. And if you actually know the basic parameters of 20th century economic history, all of that seems a little bit silly, to be honest, because the scale of the mobilization for total war in World War II was like nothing ever seen before. It's quite unique historically. Starts with World War I, where government spending as a share of GDP, both of the share of GDP measure is itself a product of World War One. Like when you do things on this scale, you need something very big to compare something else very big to, and you end up with GDP, gross national product, as your measure. In World War One, that ratio hovered between 30, 40. For some combatants, it went as high as 50% in bad times. In World War Two, that shifts up a gear. It's 40 to 60% of GDP amongst the combatant countries. So more than half of everything that's being produced is going to the war effort. So just look out in front of you and imagine the material world divided into one part, which is what you get to keep for civilian life, and the rest goes into the war effort. It's absolutely dramatic. And there was conscious learning between these two phases, modern macroeconomics, as I was saying, modern economic policy in the sense we understand it, shifted. Our entire understanding of what the economy is shifted under the impact of these two conflicts, and World War II was where that really came home. We think of, the Keynesian revolution in economics is really better understood as a total war revolution in economics, which culminated in World War II. And it was all about managing the aggregate flows of demand, of production, of supply of labor, of supply of raw materials, of currency, of how to mobilize populations, how to carve off huge slices of populations that they can actually serve. Tens of millions of men are mobilized, and women as well, in the war effort. Overwhelmingly men, though. It's worth emphasizing that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, radical programs for the mass starvation of populations. We'll say a lot more about that when we talk about the Holocaust. Deliberate efforts of starvation, not accidental, but deliberate efforts of siege and starvation applied in the case of the German invasion of the Soviet Union to 30 to 40 million inhabitants of the Soviet cities of the Western Soviet Union. And then also another kind of radical vision of the economy that emerges from the war is guerrilla war, Mao's People's War in China, where land reform and revolutionary upheaval are directly coupled to war making. So we have war economies in World War II, which are like those experienced in Britain and the United States or Germany, where you have well-managed modern economies tuned to a high state of optimization, humming along, being managed in new ways. You have the strange limbo of places like France and Denmark, which are under German occupation, whose economies are running hot but are serving German purposes. And so people are getting rich through collaboration in various ways, whilst others are enslaved, hunted down, or in the actual resistance. And then you have China, Southeast Asia, parts of the Eastern Front, where you have a war economy more in the manner of, we've spoken about this on the show, like the situation in Syria in the last 10 years, where economic survival and war making go hand in hand. Those with the guns have the food, those with the guns have the gold, the money that actually counts. And the economy is remade in the process of hand-to-hand combat and fighting. So all of this plays out in the context of this epic struggle, which ends in 1945.
How about the role that casualties played? Obviously, the scale of those casualties was appalling, but how big of a dent did they really make?
So World War II is overwhelmingly the largest modern war in terms of casualties. So the figures for deaths run between 70 and 85 million. Roughly 1/3 of that is military deaths, so 21 to 25 million. The civilian death toll is 50 to 55 million, so 1/3 to 2/3. And then within the civilian death toll, about half is directly war-related, and a half is famine, war-related disease, what you might call excess deaths that happened during this period. And you can tell from the roughness here that it's not easy to estimate, because as I was saying just a minute ago, in the most violent scenarios of the war, in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Soviet Union, the state collapses and regular data gathering is really hard to do. For people thinking about this in Britain and the United States, where many of our listeners are, and from the vantage point that we're in now, this can seem a very long way away. It's something you watch in a documentary and a film. But if you're somebody of my age, in my later 50s now, born in the mid to late 60s, even in Western Europe, this sense of fear and loss was omnipresent. Both my parents were bombed as little children. And if you spent time, as I did growing up in Germany, the impact of this war was everywhere. You couldn't go to the swimming pool without seeing, men whose bodies were torn apart by grenades and bursts of machine gun fire. This was in the early 70s. Most of my teachers in high school and elementary school were war veterans. They had frostbite wounds that would bother them, if the weather changed. If you look at a society like Germany, which is the westernmost society really badly affected by the war, and obviously the protagonist of the war that started this, and it's Germany's surrender that we're commemorating, 40% of the cohort of men born around 1920 either side lose their lives in the war, right? In the Soviet Union, the figures are more debated, but the casualties are even larger. The chances of, if you're a young man born just after World War I, of making it into the second half of the 20th century are really pretty slight in the Soviet Union. The casualty figures for the Soviet Union are hotly disputed. The Putin regime makes a great deal of the history of the war. If you want to see truly impressive military history museums, the place to go is Moscow. Difficult now, of course, but I had the privilege of seeing some of those before COVID and the war, and they're truly dramatic monuments to the heroic sacrifice of the Red Army and the Soviet people. The figures are disputed. It could be 27 million people. Russian propagandists put it higher, but I think those figures are really disputable. That's 14% of the pre-war population. So look around you, and every sixth person is dead. Obviously, and we will talk about this, the Jewish population of Europe suffers in percentage terms the highest casualties, but in absolute numbers, even in Poland and Belarus, where the Holocaust was incredibly intense, the number of non-Jewish casualties is larger. Cities like Warsaw were effectively erased in the course of the war. There are famines, pandemics. This is not just a war of bombing and shooting. The Henan famine in China took 2 million lives. 3 million died in Bengal and under British rule in India. 2 million at the end of the war in Vietnam as the Japanese occupation fails, and deliberate starvation took millions more in the Soviet Union. But the thing about this is that for all of this, and I've rehearsed these numbers deliberately just to give a sense of the scale, this was still a modern war, right? So the majority of the casualties in that, shall we say, 75 million number, the majority are deliberate. About 50 million are deliberate. Only, quote unquote, 20 million are the result of famine and disease. So this is not a war like the wars of the 17th century in Europe, or the great global crisis of the 17th century, the 30 Years' War, for instance, where you really do have military campaigns which are much smaller in scale than World War II wars, but unleash state failure, which ultimately claims far more lives, because they're such poor societies, and they're also being ravaged by the plague, which is sweeping across Eurasia. So it's not uncommon in the 17th century to see German regions losing not 3% of their population or 10% or 40% of one cohort, but 40% of their entire population dying. Like 40% of the entire population. The population actually shrinks and doesn't recover in much of Germany in the 17th century until the 18th century. Absolutely nothing like that in the 20th century. So of the 2 billion odd people alive in the late 1930s, 3% die in the early 1940s, and by 1950, the global population is at 2.5 billion and set for the most explosive growth we've ever seen in the history of our species. So this is this weird kind of duality about World War II. It's, on the one hand, clearly the most explosively violent thing, combining these total war, these giant military campaigns, the Holocaust, settler colonial projects on a huge scale, and the atomic bomb, all that on the one hand. And on the other hand, when you look at global demography, much less impactful than the general crisis of the 17th century, in part because we've gotten so good at managing collectively, right, these struggles. It's a truly bizarre. I mean, the more I think about it, and the more I realize also as I grow old, it blows my mind that I was born only 22 years after the end of this conflict. As a kid, you just take it for granted, but that's the age of the people I teach at Columbia, right? It's that close, and it's this explosively kind of a controlled explosion of an absolutely extraordinary intensity.
Yeah, it strikes me that perhaps there's two senses of total war then that could be kind of contrasted. One is sort of the product of a certain kind of order, and in which order is still somehow maintained, and resources are directed towards destruction. And the other is a kind of total war in which order is dissolved and sort of throw all the resources at something, and then you get all this kind of destruction and chaos inadvertently as a result in, I guess, earlier times. But there's still some order amid all of this destruction, I guess, in World War II. But I wanted to ask about some historical context for the war in an economic sense, because it's often argued that it really was the war that ended the Great Depression, which was, the economic context prior to the war. Is that in fact the case? I mean, how should we assess that claim?
Yeah, I mean, if you start from the what the Great Depression was, there's really two societies which experienced the full triple whammy of trade collapse, agricultural recession, and bank failure, which is the full thing of the 1929 to 33 Great Depression, and that's Germany and the United States. And in both cases, you can make the argument that both of them emerge from that epic crisis, which produced, unemployment in excess of 20% and huge contractions in GDP. It's really the only naturally induced, shall we say, economic perturbation which comes close to the impact of World War I and World War II in the 20th century, the Great Depression. In both those cases, rearmament in the case of Nazi Germany from 33 onwards created full employment by 36, booming industry, over full employment by the late 30s on the one hand, and in the US case, the entire historiography of the New Deal revolves around this issue of could more have been done by the Roosevelt administration to secure a more adequate recovery? Was the second recession that America suffered in 1937 necessary? And then does that lead one to the conclusion that it's really British and French rearmament from 39 onwards with huge orders under the cash and carry system for US, and then Roosevelt's own ramping up of American rearmament from 40 and really, really dramatically in 41, that restored the American economy to full health? And if you take a kind of Keynesian position, I don't think there's any arguing with that view, that really America between 33 and 36 suffers from chronic inadequate demand. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, but really unsteady. And then between 1939 and 1944, American GDP surges by 50%, confirming the basic Keynesian hypothesis that really if they'd done large-scale fiscal policy earlier, the American economy could have recovered much more vigorously. And there are two critiques of that, one from the left, which says, to this Keynesian progressive reformist position, the left says, well, yes, that's all very well, but it's not just that the American economy benefited from World War II, it was American business. And it's really in World War II that the New Deal lost its soul. My very distinguished colleague at Columbia, my late colleague Alan Brinkley, made this argument in his famous reassessment of the New Deal that it loses its left-wing dimensions during World War II, because that's when all of the Keynesianism, the macroeconomic management in favor of American big business takes over. And the right-wing conservative point of view, because there's always both in the US, takes the view that the whole thing was actually fake. And if you look at the non-government, non-armaments chunk of the American economy, it didn't really recover in the 40s. And it's not really till the 50s that America gets back on a muddy kind of version of its previous course in the mixed economy moment. But if you set that debate in the US to one side and just look at the world economy, and compare the situation in the 30s, where you have underemployment, falling commodity prices, lax trade, with the world by the mid-40s, which we'll talk about in the next recording, of rapid growth, rising commodity prices, and rapid absorption of labor force into production, and you ask what made the difference, it's very hard, I think, to avoid the conclusion that it's the shock, the jolt of World War II that does.
We are going to take a quick break right here, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about the economics of World War II. So in terms of the economic effects, I'm curious whether World War II ended up launching inflation then, in fact. I mean, World War I launched inflation in its time. I mean, did the same thing happen in World War II?
It emphatically did, yes. A huge inflationary pressure. There was a lot of black marketeering, substitute currencies, cigarettes, nylon stockings, all of those kind of stories. Some of the, the most foundational papers in inflation economics were written in this period. But this is the key area of policy learning compared to World War One. So the pressures are there because you've got even larger imbalances of aggregate demand and supply, right? You're forcibly converting more than half the economy. It generates huge conversion pressure, but there's a lot of learning. So in the US, where prices doubled during World War One, they go up 25% between 1939 and 1943. They're rising at 10% in 1942, and then they slap on price controls and really try and keep the lid on. And a similar story in the UK. So across the well-managed bit, and this is in a sense another way of describing the difference between the highly intensive, as you were putting it, the highly intensive version of total war and the chaotic version of total war. The highly intensive area of total war, you can tell by the fact that it experiences inflationary pressure, which is contained through government regulation, by wage bargains with trade unions, by rationing, by self-conscious macroeconomic policy, by incredibly high taxes, all of which serve to contain the inflationary pressure. And on the other hand, the basket cases, the chaotic zones, are also ones where money breaks down. Also something that happened in the 17th century. Inflation, when it destroys currency, is crucial in unleashing disaster because it breaks the bond between the city and the countryside. Peasants are no longer willing to provide food in exchange for money. The cities starve, agriculture disintegrates, and then men with guns go looking for the food because they can no longer pay for it. And that's the disaster that we see playing out in parts of the world. The most rapid hyperinflation maybe in the world actually plays out in Hungary, which was on the Axis side, and so therefore is in chaos between 44 and 46, where the currency inflates 100 quintillion times. So like even more than the Weimar Republic after World War One. But the biggest and by far the most consequential inflation is in China. Where the Kuomintang, where Chiang Kai-shek's forces, though they have, they end up on the winning side against Japan, are unable to stabilize the parts of China which the nationalist forces control. And this is a huge piece of the puzzle that explains why the communists are able to win the civil war against the Kuomintang in the after 45 is that cities like Shanghai descend into just chaotic inflationary conditions. And ultimately, the communist regime in China is built on land reform, on the barrel of the gun, but also on the back of an austere, stabilized renminbi, on a stabilized currency.
So then, in economic terms, who would we say the winners and losers of this big, resorting, this big economic and social redistribution? Yeah, who came out on top? I mean, how did labor do, say, or if we were to compare that with the role of capital in relationship to labor?
Again, I think your distinction between the controlled total war and the chaotic total war really is helpful here, in that if you look at the controlled cases and say you take the long-running data on inequality that, say, the famous team around Thomas Piketty in Paris put together, there's no question that beginning with World War One, but then with World War Two for real, the era of the total wars is the era of what American labor economists call the Great Compression. So it's a period in which inequality in income decreases, inequality in wealth to a degree also, but inequality in income very dramatically decreases. And you could take this as a sort of social bargain type of argument, right? If you're going to run total wars and you're going to hold society together, which is exactly the hallmark of World War II in Western Europe and North America, then you are going to make big societal bargains. You're going to renegotiate the social contract. And you're going to do that by avoiding strikes, by making wage concessions to crucial workers through trade unions. And you are going to amplify welfare spending. And you are going to pay for this. And you're going to control excessive demand and inflation by imposing punitive taxation on highest incomes. And so most societies exit World War II with tax rates, marginal tax rates for the top 1%, well in excess of 50% and then closer to 80% plus, even in the United States through to the late 1950s, right? And that's part of this deal. And it shows up in the data. This is the moment of the famous Treaty of Detroit, where the American auto industry, the bastion of mass manufacturing, as a result of its experience during the war, in the aftermath of the war, signs a formal, if you like, peace accord with the auto workers union, agreeing the terms and conditions of a privatized welfare state for American workers. We see the breakthrough of labour in Britain, with the trade unions having played a key role in managing the home front in World War II. Ernest Bevin, TGWU workers, so Transport and General Workers Union boss and a pivotal figure in the wartime administration, and then foreign secretary, literally running foreign policy for the Attlee government after 45, a union boss. That era is one in which indeed there is a huge shift, but this is the virtue then of how illuminating it is, and to think in terms of this contrast between organized total war and chaotic total war. The aim of the game is, of course, to prevent revolutionary challenge. And so World War I ends with revolutionary upsurge, practically everywhere after 1970, even for heaven's sake in Britain and even in the United States. There's a vast surge of general strike activity. There's the Red Scare for a reason, in a sense, in 1919 in the US. Right? Much of it's cooked up, but nevertheless, there really is a militant mobilization. And there is, of course, also revolutionary pressure in Europe, Western Europe, notably after 45, but it's much more contained. It's channeled through trade unions, it's channeled through the communist parties, which themselves has undergone Stalinization since the 20s. And so it's a much more concerted, controlled situation. So on the one hand, Labour wins, but it wins within a game which is no longer going to allow radical options. And it's not by accident that the revolutionary upheaval after World War II is not in Europe, though there is civil war in Italy effectively at the end and civil war in France. But in both cases, it's a contained struggle. It's in Asia where we really see, full-on revolutionary struggle playing out with such dramatic consequences in China, in Vietnam, in Korea, in Malaya. There's the free-for-all, which isn't really frozen back into place in Asia until the 60s, maybe, and you take China and the Cultural Revolution in the 70s, right? So that's, I think, the crucial thing to bear in mind, is that the European progress of labor and the American is manifest. You see it in the numbers, you can see it from space. It's huge. There is a big shift, but it's on the condition that we all agree to play by the rules of a modified version of the status quo.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely delve into some of the after effects of that next week. But I guess to end this conversation, it strikes me in having this conversation that, there's this, term that we've used plenty of times before that's definitely in vogue right now, namely industrial policy. And thinking about the war and all of the concentration of resources and in the ways we've been talking about, I mean, does this basically amount to the biggest industrial policy ever in the form of World War II? And if so, what were the kind of long-run effects of this industrial policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of interesting rewriting. I mean, I think it's the other way around, in that this was the moment, really, World War I is the moment that opens the minds of people to the possibilities of concerted industrial programming, of planning, right? This is the moment when World War I is the moment when Lenin, looking at the German war economy, goes, oh, this whole planned economy socialist thing, we could actually do it, and then communism is always, I can't remember which one it is Soviets plus electrification, right? Electrification being the industrialization part. And then in the 30s, of course, you get the Stalinist experiment, which, I mean, to describe that as industrial policy really does, I think, sort of undersell what's going on. It's industrialization by means of social revolution. But around the world, we see nationalist regimes in the 20s and 30s experimenting with efforts to build steel plants, to build cement capacity, to build railways, to build infrastructure in a massive way. And World War II takes this all to a new level. There's a degree even of preparatory pre-building for the war. So not just rearmament, as in the German case, like build me as many aircraft as possible, but the British build these shadow factories where they create what will be a facility for making Spitfires if the worst case happens, right? So it's sort of a pre-planned expansion that you could operationalize. And so broadly speaking, yes, it's a huge transformative process. I mean, just in the North American context, because it's topical, it's well known, I think, the Californian economy is transformed by the aerospace revolution of World War II, because the big expensive thing in World War II armaments is aircraft. I mean, if the iconic image of World War I is a shell factory, the iconic image of industrial production in World War II is aircraft, for good reason, because they consume, in the countries which go heavy on strategic bombing, 40 to 45% of the total war effort is aircraft, 45%. Everything else is, the ammunition, the tanks, everything else is tiny by comparison with that. And building those facilities on the west coast of the United States transforms the Californian economy into the post-war period. But it also reconfigures the Canadian-American. We've been talking a lot about Canada on this show, but the North American manufacturing complex in the Midwest that bolts onto Canada, it's not really the Midwest, it's around the Great Lakes, right? The Michigan Windsor connection is built during World War II because the aluminium is made on the Canadian side and then imported into the American industrial complex. And because this is the wartime and the Canadians are part of the British Empire and running on Lend-Lease, like there is this direct connection between the Canadian and US economy, which is built out to an extent never seen before. So yes, industrial policy all over the world. There's no question, I think, that much of the dynamism of the West German economy after 1945 comes from the expertise that built up in the mass production of weapons during World War II. Huge parts of the infrastructure of Eastern Europe are inherited from wartime industrialization, despite the devastation. So yes, it's huge, and it's not for nothing that the exponents of industrial policy, whether it's the Green New Deal people or by all accounts the Operation Warp Speed people under Trump in 2020, they were all carrying around histories of World War II mass production. Not really so much as a how-to guide, because we're a long way from the 1940s, but more as a kind of inspirational credo, like, here, we can do this big. Folks in the Anglophone world will know the image of Rosie the Riveter, right? The strong-armed female aircraft, and what she's riveting is aircraft bodies.
Yeah, that's a useful clarification, because I think sometimes when we talk about industrial policy now, we're talking about maybe shifting kinds of industries or focusing on particular kinds of industries, but there were huge swaths of society that were being industrialized maybe in the first place, or just like
absolutely. The great migration of the black population from the American South to the North is driven by this. The jobs that opened up all of a sudden. We're talking about full-blown social transformation, or the planned economy of. It's a heretical thing to say, but the planned economy of post-war China has a lot to do with the planning efforts by both the Chinese nationalists and the Japanese that took place in the 30s and 40s as part of the war effort. This is really a moment of collective learning. And this goes back to my impatience, I expressed right at the beginning when people invoke war economies today. We're not talking about the same level of transformation, and it's not helpful to do that. Then the problem is that we then we scare ourselves. We get scared of our own shadow. With nothing that. Very few, anyway, of the current demands demand anything remotely on this kind of scale, and yet it, for good reason, remains a kind of an icon, a totem, like something we refer back to as a moment of mobilization.
Well, I think that's a persuasive call to stick with us in the weeks ahead as we continue talking about the war. Like I said, this will be 3 parts, so 2 more to come. This week, though, we'll have to leave this off for now, but next week we'll be back as always. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners, including John Tucker, Jennifer Sheehy Skeffington, David Köhn in Berlin, Al Fox, Joe Cancella, Piotr Yander, Fabrizio Ziegler, Hannes, Andras, and Will Swanson. I do hope I pronounced those names right. Some of them are tricky. Apologies if not. But, as always, we always love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages for us on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwoesPod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next